Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, here with Graham Watson, who's going to be talking about his book, all about Charlotte Bronte and the Bronte sisters and Jane Eyre. And his, I've been talking to him for about 10 minutes, and I can't tell you how much you're going to enjoy this talk. Before we get started, I just want to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. Couldn't do without them. I'd also like to thank Graham for letting us share this program with other libraries because, when libraries work together, we just make magic. And we have a lot of people signed up today. So I think we're going to have this incredible discussion. And a lot of that is because we were allowed to share it with our local libraries. If you would have questions for Graham, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you just want to chat with each other, the chat is open and you can certainly make your comments there, but it sometimes goes by too quickly for me to catch all the questions. If you want to buy signed books from Graham, you can do that from our favorite local indie bookstore, Aesop's Fable. He sent a bunch of book plates, signed book plates to them, and you're going to want this book because it's awesome. So Graham Watson, he's gonna tell you a little bit about himself, but he told me in an email recently that his book is getting such great press that the curator of the Bronte Parsonage Museum described his book as one of the best biographies ever written about Charlotte. So this is going to be the best talk on Charlotte Bronte you've ever been to. Graham, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. How can I live up to that? I don't. Well, good afternoon, America. I'm calling you from Scotland here in the UK. And yes, I'm the author of this book, The Invention of Charlotte Brontë. It came out in the US and Canada last Tuesday, published by Pegasus. It just came out in paperback in the UK. And you might, if you're a Bronte fan, wonder why there is yet another biography of Charlotte Brontë, because there are entire libraries filled with books about the Brontes. Mine is different because it does look at something that hasn't necessarily been examined much before in the lives of the Brontes, and that's Charlotte Bronte's last 5 years, and then the few years after her death, when her fame being was becoming iconic, a word that's generally overused. But I was saying to Mina just before everyone joined that when you think about Charlotte Bronte and the impact that she has on many people's lives, even today, you have to think of someone like Elvis or Marilyn Monroe because people take her to their heart. Not just Charlotte, but her other sisters, Emily and Anne, authors of Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey and The Tenant in Wildfell Hall. So with my book, I look at, as I say, the last 5 years. Now, why did I pick those 5 years? Because those 5 years cover Charlotte Bronte's friendship with Elizabeth Gaskell. My biography actually opens with Charlotte Bronte and the novelist Elizabeth Gaskell shaking hands. For me, that was the real narrative beginning of this story. Elizabeth Gaskell was an established novelist. She'd written a novel called Mary Barton. We know her now through many of the other works that she wrote after this period, but she, like many people at the time, was interested in who the author of Jane Eyre was. When Jane Eyre was published, it was published under the pseudonym Currer Bell. And all of literary London was fascinated by who Currer Bell could be because Jane Eyre was seen to be a controversial book. It was seen to be quite saucy. It was seen to be quite dangerous in some ways because running through it was this challenge to authority. We see it now very much as a romance, and certainly it does have those elements of romance, but there was also a disruptive element to the book. And it raised lots of eyebrows, not just in England, but in America when it was published very soon after the UK. Mystery and intrigue reigned about who the Bells were. So the three sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, who grew up in Yorkshire in England, published their novels under the names Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. Charlotte was Currer Bell. It was, of course, a secret, but not for long. They found that they couldn't keep the secret very long because so many people were intrigued. Among them was Elizabeth Gaskell, because the novels were so accomplished and so wonderful that many people thought they must be existing writers who were hiding in plain sight under these pseudonyms. Of course, they weren't, they were first time authors, so it was even more unbelievable than people had already imagined. And people were trying to work out who they were. Elizabeth Gaskell was one of these people. So she was following the news, which was being reported in newspapers and journals of the time, as people tried to work her out. But Elizabeth Gaskell and Charlotte Bronte had a mutual friend who did know that she was the author of Jane Eyre, and this friend brought them together. The friend brought them together because she felt that Charlotte Bronte needed a friend like Elizabeth Gaskell. What many people didn't know was that at that point in 1850, Charlotte had suffered the loss of her entire family apart from her father. So Charlotte was the last of six talented children. The four that we all know, Branwell, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, who lived to adulthood, are the most famous of the six. The elder two died aged 10 and 11. But Charlotte had lost all of her siblings in between 1848 and 49 in a 9-month period in this shocking spate of bereavements, leaving her, of course, completely bereft and distraught. We can imagine one death having that impact, but three in quick succession was, of course, completely devastating to her. It happened just as she was becoming famous, as her first novel, Jane Eyre, was published, and then the second, Shirley, was published. She was being exposed to the world, even more vulnerable than she was anyway as an individual. When Elizabeth Gaskell came to know her, she wanted to know what was the secret behind Jane Eyre. Who was Jane Eyre? Was there a real Jane Eyre? Jane Eyre was captioned an autobiography. So many people wondered whether it really was a novel, or was it really an autobiography? People imagined there might be a real person called Jane Eyre, and that Currer Bell, Charlotte Bronte, was its editor. So there was many confusions about it all. I can skip forward a little bit to talk about the second half of my book. So the first half looks at Charlotte Bronte's last 5 years. And in those 5 years, we have bereavement, grief, loss, but also Charlotte's triumph, her continual attempt to redraw her life and reestablish herself, to bring herself back together. It's one of the things I greatly admire about the woman, that she was able to pool her resources even when everything was destroying her, even when the forces of tragedy were smashing her down again and again and again. She still regrouped, somehow pulled herself back together and faced the future. She had that resolve that she would keep going. It's remarkable. And through her letters, I reconstruct how she did that, how she continually tried to face the future without the past that she thought would go with her, her brothers and sisters.
So let me go back a little bit. Now, you're not an historian. This is your first book. You know, what brought you to wanting to write about the Brontes? I know you're like an expert on the Brontes, but why? Like, what were you a child being like, I love Jane Eyre, I'm going to write about Charlotte Bronte someday?
Well, almost actually, you'd be surprised, but I started reading about the Brontes when I was very young. My mother was a great reader and belonged to the local library, and so I became a great a member of the library, and we read everything. And among those books, when I was maybe about 13, was Jane Eyre. My mum had read everything by the Brontes, and so like most people had knew them from school and things like that. So I became interested in the doomed geniuses and romantic solitude out on the moors, the myths that we all know about the Brontes. That was interesting to me as well. The mystique of them, the theatricality. I started reading some of the biographies of them and realized that that wasn't the full story. There was something much larger there. But I also knew there was part of the story that no one really talked about, and that was what happened after Charlotte's death and how the very first biography of her was written. The first biography was written about 2 years after her death, and it was written by Elizabeth Gaskell, her friend. It was hugely controversial and had to be banned because so many people who were named in it threatened to sue Gaskell and her publisher. And it had to be rewritten twice in 6 months. Now, behind the scandal was Elizabeth Gaskell's intention to shame many of the people she felt had treated Charlotte Bronte badly in her life. So it was a deliberate attempt to try and publicly castigate people. It backfired. Now, the consensus we've been left with is that Gaskell's biography, The Life of Charlotte Bronte, isn't a reliable book. I present a different picture. I say that it's not quite an open and shut case. To go back to your question, why them? The more I looked into this, the more I realized there was a much larger story that biographers didn't really speak about, because most biographies of Charlotte Bronte end with her death. The curtain falls on her death and that's it. In my book, she does die, of course, halfway through the book this time. And the second half is about Gaskell trying to put the pieces of this woman back together for the general public, to try and explain this woman's talent and the phenomena of her family, and received nothing but trouble as thanks for it. So to answer your question properly, I always felt that someone would tell this story and go beyond the curtain fall of Charlotte's death and tell us what happened behind the scenes with these real people. How was the material gathered, and how did she present the story for the public? How did Elizabeth Gaskell present the story? And no one ever did present it, so I realized that I had to write this book.
Yes, absolutely. And Vicky says in a couple of places that it's wonderful. Everybody should read it. Which I agree with. But I want to do a little bit of crowdsourcing now and ask people what was their first memory of reading Jane Eyre? And I'll share mine, which was I was causing trouble in seventh grade, and my English teacher, named Mr. English, said, "You have to read this book. You know, it was Jane Eyre." And I was just like, I felt like I was being punished, but I wasn't, because I absolutely fell in love with it. And he knew that I was bored. So he gave me a book that would challenge me. And so not just for that reason, I love Jane Eyre, but like I just absolutely fell in love with it. And I think that is something that Charlotte, all of his sisters really had that skill of making a book resonate with you for whatever reason that, but so you saw, like I said, right in the chat where your experience of Jane Eyre. I will share this chat with Graham after the talk. But when like you've read the books, you're seeing that people aren't writing about it, but you had a really interesting experience in finding the letters. Why did you have access to the letters?
Well, I asked. So I started to search for them. The Bronte letters are in archives all over the world, mainly in the UK. There's a huge collection of them in the New York Public Library as well. My interest in history is in the written record. Of course, there are many biographies and there are many histories, and this applies to every subject. I really wanted to know what people actually said. I didn't want to be told what someone's interpretation of what happened. I wanted to see the evidence. I wanted to see the receipts, and I wanted to make up my own mind about that. So when we go back to the written record, what we discover is a history that's messier, more complex than what biographers have turned it into, because generally what we deal with is what the biographers are telling us happened. And that's often affected by the time they live in and the prejudices or the liberalities of the time. Everything is seen through a different lens. So once we go back to something like 1850 and see everything on paper at the time, we start to get a different picture of the reality and the confines of the situation. So as well as looking at manuscript material, I read the newspapers of the time. I sourced all the local newspapers digitally, and read the daily newspapers to see what were people's general concerns of the time, what were their interests. Not so different to today: foreign wars, royal family gossip, adverts for everything, for miracle cures, for every health complaint you can mention. And with the Bronte manuscripts themselves, I did have to look at every piece of manuscript that I could find. So every letter by all of the Brontes and all their associates. And then looking at Elizabeth Gaskell's archive as well, I looked at the original manuscript of the life of Charlotte Bronte. And again, you literally do hold history in your hands. And it makes it more immediate because all the intervening voices are cut away, and suddenly you're able to access directly these people. My book is based entirely on that information. It's based entirely on the first-hand records. I ignore the other biographers. One of the questions I set myself was, how would we write about the Brontes if no one else had written about them? What would we say? How would we reconstruct their lives if we didn't have the mythic ideas of them sweeping about the moors in their cloaks? If we didn't have that, what would we say just based on the written record? So I hope that my biography answers that question. For many readers, it's reframed the Brontes in a new way. The book is just being reviewed at the moment in the US. So Kirkus, Booklist, Washington Post are all reviewing it at the moment. And all of them are saying that it recalibrates our vision of Charlotte Bronte and of Elizabeth Gaskell and resets them as new people and strips away the mythology. And what's valuable about that is that we see that they weren't so different to us and to our concerns. And the world that they were living in was a world filled with media as well. We tend not to imagine the Victorian world being like that, but saturated by news, saturated by gossip and magazines and books. And so that was the entertainment of the day. Of course, there was no visual media like TV and movies and things like that, but everything else was infiltrating everybody's lives and guiding them and important. So an interesting thing happened after Elizabeth Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Brontë was published, in that it caused such a controversy that people were writing about it in the press and writing letters to the press. So we see almost a kind of Twitter-like scandal unfolding, a firestorm that we're all familiar with seeing on social media day after day after day, that editors eventually had to call an end to and say, we are not publishing anything else about the subject. It's closed. My book encompasses all of that. Now, that scandal sucked in many of the people who'd actually known the Brontes. You mentioned Jane Eyre. So, what was revealing about Elizabeth Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Brontë was that the school in Jane Eyre, the infamous Lowood School, was based on a real school that Charlotte Brontë had attended, and its conditions were just as hellish as Jane Eyre describes. What Elizabeth Gaskell did was track down the other pupils who'd attended that school and the teachers. And you can read their perspectives in my book, because they all became embroiled in the fight to control how Charlotte was perceived after her death. Their perspectives are there as well. So going back again to the written record and to the original voices that are preserved in the written manuscripts, they're fresh, they're vital, they're full of life, and they're full of ambiguities. Their minds change. They're not one thing or another. Their perspectives start to change over time. And once we start to account for that, we see how history starts to form through people's ideas, assumptions. Things become set in stone, and then they become myths that people just imagine are true.
Yeah, I think we're we were talking about this before. We're easily led sometimes, humans. But I'm very curious about this chat, because people have read Jane Eyre and the Brontes very young. Wuthering Heights,
Yeah.
very young, like 9, 10, 11, 12. And I'm curious, as a follow-up question, if you've reread it as an adult and had a different perspective on it, because we do that. But to go back to our questions, you these letters have always been there. Like they, obviously they existed through time. What made you like want to do it from a first person perspective as opposed to all of those people that had access to the same materials but didn't use them?
Well, the interesting thing about that is that the full transcription of Charlotte Bronte's letters didn't end until 2008, believe it or not. So we had partial letters. We had letters in various collections that had been published, but it was only between 1995 and 2008 that the full transcription of them was carried out. So in historical terms, very recently that we've had a complete view of Charlotte Bronte's own correspondence. Elizabeth Gaskell's correspondence was collected as well, Charlotte Bronte's father, and many other people. So it's really the process of time essentially has released more and more information that earlier biographers didn't have access to. So, for example, if I went back 30 years and looked at biographies that existed then, some of those biographers wouldn't have had access to the information that I've got access to, because those letters have resurfaced, reappeared, and are now available to us. So each time something new appears, and letters do appear every so often, it gives us just it doesn't completely change our view of the past, but it does give us a new insight. And sometimes there's a telling detail in the letter that connects to something else, and we think, that's the missing piece. Yeah.
So, I guess I don't really understand that, because letters aren't copyrighted versus the actual works, and the works haven't been
Yeah.
in copyright for a long time. So were the letters just with the families and they didn't share them, or how did that work?
So the letters of all of the Bronte family uh, ended up with they started off with the recipients of those letters, the people who they'd been written to, and then they were handed on to their descendants or sold at auctions, and then went into private collections, and many of them were never seen again. So we may have known that there were letters to specific people, but people hadn't seen their contents, or we'd seen redacted examples of them. but many of them were considered lost or locked away. It was only a few years ago, actually, that one of the biggest literary collections was unlocked for the very first time, and they released it on their entire contents. And that was it's called the Blavatnik Honrusfield Library. And that contained works by Robert Burns, Jane Austen, the Brontes, and it unleashed lots of other material. I mean, with the Brontes specifically, the gathering of letters has happened over a long period. So you're right, the Bronte novels were in copyright until into the 20th century, actually. The letters themselves just weren't as available as the novels. Certainly some of them were published because Elizabeth Gaskell used many of Charlotte Bronte's letters for her Life of Charlotte Bronte. I quote from them as well. But there were many others that Gaskell deselected in the process, and many others that she had never seen. So in some ways, I've one advantage over Elizabeth Gaskell in that I can see more material than she saw. And her advantage over me is that she knew these people, so she could interview them. So she compensated for the information that I can see now. So yes, it's really just to answer your question, it's really because much of the material was locked away in archives that wasn't available to the public or to academics. And it only appeared at auction afterwards.
And before we started the session, you actually told me that you had been able to meet the descendants and touch some of the stuff.
Well, yeah, well, so the Bronte Parsonage Museum is the home of the Bronte family. There's another museum, well, there's another location called the Bronte Birthplace, which is only just opened, which is where the family were born. The family left there in 1820 and moved to Haworth, the famous parsonage, and were there, and they lived and died there. And they were there until Patrick Bronte died in 1861, so spent a total of 41 years there. And then there we have the largest collection of manuscripts and belongings of the Brontes. What happened immediately after the death of Patrick Bronte, who was the Bronte family's father, was that Charlotte Bronte's widower decided to keep some of the belongings of the family and sell the entire house contents. So everything from candlesticks down to chairs and plates was sold on the open market. We have a complete inventory of that. And ever since that day, everything has been making its way back to that house in Haworth. So the house in Haworth, the Bronte parsonage, is filled with their own belongings and their own furniture. It wasn't always like that. It's been built over a long period and through the dedication of people like the curator Anne Dinsdale, who's one of my heroes. But I was very grateful to be allowed access to their archives, their manuscript archives, and to be able to look at the Bronte family's own papers. And it's quite an experience, actually, again, it's that touching of history, that proximity disappears, and suddenly you have Charlotte Bronte's own spectacles, for example, the ones that, and I didn't wear them, but I held them up to look through the lenses, and I did, and she was very short-sighted. And I did think, through these lenses, she saw the events that became Jane Eyre in her head, and she wrote it, and then it went into my head and went into your head, and through these glasses.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite an extraordinary mind-bending experience to actually be able to hold things like that. These things aren't, they're in glass cases in the museum, and the things are rotated, the objects are rotated every so often.
Mm-hmm.
Most people who go to that house find it a very emotional experience if they're a Bronte fan, because if you are a Bronte fan, it's, as I said earlier, it's close to the heart, and it's an emotional connection that you have to them. So to step over that threshold into their house filled with their belongings, many people feel they've come home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine. I'm gonna have to make that trip. Diane wants to know, were there any descendants from Charlotte's immediate family?
No, no. All of the Bronte children died childless. Charlotte was the only one who married. She married in 1854, but sadly, she only lived for 9 months after she married, and died in March 1855. She was pregnant when she died, but the child did not survive. So no, there were no descendants of the Brontes at all. There are descendants of Charlotte's father's family. So he had brothers and he had siblings. So some of their descendants are still around today. So there is Bronte DNA out there. Some of them are in the States, actually.
Well, you had mentioned something about the states, in fact, Massachusetts, in your
Hmm.
research. What was that?
Yes. Yeah, well, that was a really interesting thing that I discovered. I mentioned earlier that the Brontes published their novels under pseudonyms, the Bells, Currer Ellis and Acton Bell. And most biographers have understood that there was a time when they were living under these pseudonyms and then they were known as the Brontes. So I wanted to know, when was that precise moment? What was the turning point? What happened? And going through records, going through newspapers in America and the UK, I found the moment where a man who'd been a weaver in Yorkshire emigrated to Massachusetts,
Mhm.
and he recognized the locations that were in Jane Eyre and in Charlotte Bronte's novel Shirley, and started to add up the connections and realized that they described the village that he grew up in, Haworth, which was the Bronte family's village. And he wrote to his local newspaper to say, I think these are written by the daughters of the Reverend Patrick Bronte. And that matched one of the theories that was out there about the Bronte family. He was correct, of course. It was transmitted to London and became a sensation. And Charlotte Bronte was exposed on the front page of a newspaper in England. So it began in America. Yes, they discovered the Brontes.
Us people in Massachusetts have always been rebels, I guess, troublemakers.
Um,
Um, Maria wants to know what was the most difficult aspect of your research?
oh gosh. Hi Maria. Some of the research was so detailed that it took your research was about 2 years just research. So I compiled a timeline of every single day for every year that the Brontes lived for a period of 20 years and isolated every single day in those years back to the written record so that I mean, all of this doesn't end up in the book. So don't fear not, readers, all of that information is not there. But it created a very firm foundation on which I could base the book so that I knew the parameters of the reality. Um, some of the most difficult parts of the research were gaps, looking at where there were gaps in the known story. So whenever you do research like this, there's two versions. There's the conventional wisdom, and then there's the mess of the documents that the conventional wisdom is ultimately based on. And sometimes trying to reconcile the two was very difficult to when you find that the sources say something very different to what the biographers say. What you then have to do is look back at how the biographers' ideas have evolved from one book to another, and then you find the origin point. So, for example, there's an idea that Branwell Bronte, the brother of the family, and not Emily Bronte, was the author of Wuthering Heights. You can still see people on the internet saying things like this. Oh, Branwell wrote that book. He didn't. But we can see the origin of that myth going back to a specific published source where someone had an idea that that is what happened. And remarkably, it's never gone away, but we know it's a myth. Um, so going back to Maria's question, what was the most difficult part? The research was a thrill. Actually, it felt like it never ended, and it still hasn't ended. I'm continuing to do more research, but a difficult part was actually writing Charlotte Bronte's death. I knew that I would have to do that, obviously, but I was surprised at how affected by it I was.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It would be just really quickly, what was the name of the weaver who emigrated to Massachusetts?
To consult my own book for this. Let's see. It was I can't remember off the top of my head. It's not unbelievable. Um, I'll find it and it'll come back to me.
Okay.
Um,
Judith would like to know, and I'm sticking with research right now, and then we're going to get into the actual scandal. Um, what were some of the most interesting or unusual findings that you discovered in your research? I would also like to know if there was anything that really surprised you.
well, yeah, there was something that really surprised me, and this was the thing that actually became central to the book. So the conventional wisdom about Elizabeth Gaskell's biography, The Life of Charlotte Bronte, is that it's unreliable, that we can't trust it, and it's full of scurrilous gossip that she just gathered, and that she took many things at face value, and that she published an apology, basically saying, "Yes, I'm to blame. I took everything at face value, and I apologize." What surprised me was discovering that she'd been forced to make that confession by her publisher to
Oh,
avoid being sued. And behind the scenes were all these letters with Elizabeth Gaskell saying every single word of that book is true. But if we have to say otherwise, then so be it.
oh my
That's
gosh,
the thing that
wow.
shocked me. Yeah. What that does is really pivots how we've seen the whole story. We've always seen the story that way, that it can't be trusted, and that therefore Elizabeth Gaskell wasn't trustworthy. When we understand that she was forced, almost like a witch, into making a false confession
Mm,
just to satisfy these demands and to make sure that the publisher wasn't destroyed by a legal lawsuit,
mhm.
it really changes the perspective of how we view the whole thing. So that was the thing that surprised me most. Thank you for the question.
Yeah. Crazy. I mean, you wonder how that if that happens now. Of course it does.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
okay, so let's get into the actual book and the two parts of it, which is the first part is Charlotte's life. The second part is
yeah,
actually what happened after her death.
yes,
So there
yeah,
was a scandal, right? Like what there was
yeah.
some
Huge
serious,
scandal.
yeah, what was that all about?
So as you say, the first half of the book is about Charlotte Bronte's life, the last 5 years of her life, and the second half looks at Elizabeth Gaskell being asked to write Charlotte Bronte's life story by Charlotte's father. She'd been waiting to do this for quite a long time because she knew there was a story to tell. She thought that Charlotte Bronte was an exceptional person, unlike anyone she'd ever met before. And when Charlotte died, she was already thinking someone has to tell this story. So when Patrick Bronte suggested that she tell the story, of course, it was very opportune. Um, she started to ask questions about Charlotte Bronte. Now, she'd known Charlotte for 5 years, and part of my book reconstructs the many conversations that Charlotte Bronte and Elizabeth Gaskell actually had together, in which Charlotte divulged many of the details of her life. How do we know that happened? Because Elizabeth Gaskell mentions those conversations in other letters to other friends, where she summarizes the conversation. So I could piece all of the conversations back together and put them into a chronology. Um, when when she started to ask questions, she began with Charlotte's father, um, and the elderly Reverend Patrick Bronte, and Charlotte's widower Arthur Nichols. And she began asking them, what was she? Tell me about her early life. Tell me about her, the influences that shaped her. And she realized very early that they were very cagey with her. They didn't want to divulge much information about her. Um, Arthur,
But
Charlotte,
wasn't it her
yeah,
father that asked her to write the story?
yeah, that's right. Yeah, he did. But what he wanted her to do was write a very public, kind of superficial story that just talked about Charlotte's public works, her novels, and not go into detail. The standard for Victorian biographies at that time was that you would really just talk about births, deaths, and marriages and public works. You wouldn't talk about feelings. And Elizabeth Gaskell felt that that was going to be very important to the story of Charlotte Bronte. Once she understood that they were cagey and that Arthur, specifically Charlotte's husband, didn't think it was a good idea that any biography be written about his wife, his is a perspective that's very interesting because he knew that as soon as the doors were open to the public, they would never close again, and that the public appetite would be insatiable for details on the Brontes. Now, somehow he was correct about that. He had the prescience to see that that is what would happen, and of course, that is what happened. Charlotte's father didn't necessarily see that. He thought that a public tribute would be most fitting because there's still lots of scurrilous gossip in the media at the time about what kind of life someone who'd written Jane Eyre would have lived. Was she a loose woman? Was she scandalous? Was she decadent? Of course, Charlotte wasn't any of those things, but people came to those conclusions because they thought Jane Eyre was a passionate book. Um, so when Gaskell started to understand that she wouldn't get far with Charlotte's
Wait,
husband,
one second. There are sirens going on because apparently I don't know what's happening like locally, but apparently Spider-Man is being filmed there, and so you might hear sirens and you might hear explosions.
yeah, Yes, don't worry if there are any explosions or sirens or screams, because yes, the new Spider-Man movie is being filmed a few streets away. So if you Google Glasgow and Spider-Man, you'll see the filming shots that are happening. So Tom Holland is running about outside in his costume, which might be more interesting to people than Charlotte Bronte, but not to me.
No, no,
Um,
no, no. It's just an aside, just an aside.
yes, please do not panic. So Gaskell really wanted to know who had the real story in Charlotte Bronte, and her father and husband directed Elizabeth Gaskell to Charlotte's friends, who really wanted to settle scores about some of the things that had happened with Charlotte. Many of them felt that Charlotte had been treated badly all her life by the people around her,
Mm.
and they felt that now was the time to set the record straight. So one of those people was Charlotte Bronte's best friend, Ellen Nussey, who had kept at least 500 letters from Charlotte Bronte and told Elizabeth Gaskell everything, absolutely everything about her, including all the things that Patrick and Arthur didn't want Elizabeth Gaskell to know. Now, when Elizabeth Gaskell realised this, what she did was decide that she wasn't going to show Patrick and Arthur any of the material that she was writing, would just tell Ellen about it and keep it so as a surprise for Patrick, because she decided these were two of the people who treated Charlotte badly, and she was going to get her revenge on Charlotte's behalf on these people too. So Gaskell started, once she started to ask questions about Charlotte Bronte, the angrier she became, and she felt that Charlotte was a woman of the greatest talents, but had been treated almost like a servant her whole life. And she felt that was obviously wrong, and that it was, almost an accident of the circumstances she'd been born into. But because she knew that Charlotte Bronte had been patronised by so many people and maybe overlooked by many all of her life, she decided to essentially say, you were wrong, and this is how wrong you were, and to publicly name many of the people who'd been mistreating Charlotte Bronte. So it was kind of her revenge on Charlotte Bronte's behalf. As she started to ask questions, she decided to become a kind of Valkyrie and deliver justice to Charlotte. So this is something else that's new. This is that I discovered during the research, that she decided that the living could get lawyers if they didn't like what she'd written, but the dead had to rely on her.
Mhm.
And this is one of the questions that biographers always have to ask themselves: who are you serving? Are you serving the public? Are you serving the living witnesses, or are you serving the dead who possibly can't answer or can't defend themselves? And Elizabeth Gaskell decided that she was going to defend the dead, Charlotte Bronte and her sisters, and that's why the book became so controversial, because the living people who were mentioned in Gaskell's book were not happy and threatened to sue Gaskell's publisher when the book was published. Here's more sirens. um, yeah,
Spidey is like
Spider-Man
going by.
going by again. They might be filming the same bit again and again, so this might keep happening. But so yeah, when Gaskell's book was published, it caused a sensation. Of course, everyone who'd read Jane Eyre wanted to read the real story behind that book.
Mhm.
So it became a bestseller, but the publisher realized they had to ban it because so many people were upset by what the book said about them.
Mhm.
And who were those people? So the headmaster of the school that Charlotte Bronte had attended was still alive, the one that's in Jane Eyre. He was still around and upset about how his school and he had been characterized. A woman who'd had an affair with Charlotte Bronte's brother was also very upset to be indicated in the book. Charlotte's own father was upset about it. So there were ultimately, Elizabeth Gaskell said that everyone connected in any way to the Brontes was upset about this book, and maybe they should just have an introduction that just apologizes in advance for anything that might upset anyone in any way, and put that out instead. But her publisher realized that either they would go to court and try and defend what would ultimately come out as hearsay, or they would have to say, we're at fault and we won't do it again. And
Mm.
that's what happened. So Gaskell had to say, yes, sorry, it's all gossip. My mistake. Behind the scenes, of course, she knew it wasn't. It was all true. And history has proven her right in many instances. However, it's still the case that Gaskell's reputation was damaged by this. She was seen to be an injudicious biographer and a journalist who wasn't really paying attention to evidence, that she was just inventing what she didn't know. It couldn't be further from the truth. remarkably, I'm the first biographer to actually state this. All the others before me accept that she was at fault. I can prove that she wasn't. I can actually demonstrate, going back to the records, she wasn't at fault. She was telling the truth, but
Mhm.
she was silenced by the forces she tried to expose.
It's nice that this is just, anyways, I'm going to say that in the description of the book, because before I get into trouble about saying something else, um, that the book, Elizabeth Gaskell's book, uncovers secrets of illicit love, family discord, and professional rivalries. Now, is that, um, you say that all of that is true, like everything that she wrote is pretty much the truth from all these letters. So, it what was Charlotte like secretly in love with somebody but married this other guy? What's happening there?
Well, yes is the short answer to that. She was secretly in love with someone else, a married man, in fact,
Mm,
at a different time to when she married her husband. In her earlier years, in her 20s, she went to a finishing school in Belgium, and it seems that she fell in love with the only man who taught there, the headmaster of the school. And she wrote him lots of letters after she left the school. Some of them are preserved. Interestingly, he tore them all up and someone stitched them all back together to read them. And we can read these really heartbreaking love letters where she's appealing for any kind of connection and any kind of love. They're desperate letters. And these are one of the things that Gaskell found during her research. So she knew, Elizabeth Gaskell, that is, knew that there was something that the Bronte family, the remaining Bronte family, Patrick, her father, and Arthur, Charlotte's widower, didn't really want to talk about. And that was what happened when she was in Brussels.
mm,
Elizabeth Gaskell decided that she would go to Brussels and find this man. I document this in the book and interview him in person to find out his perspective. And sure enough, he had the letters which demonstrated that Charlotte had had these feelings for him. Now, he was an older man at that point, not that much older than Charlotte Bronte, but he was married with 6 children. And she was one pupil in many classrooms filled with young women. So I think he was used to, people having the wrong feelings for him in a way. Um, it's interesting that he kept those letters. He went on to read the Bronte novels. Actually, he read Jane Eyre, and many people have wondered whether Rochester and Jane Eyre is partly inspired by that man, or maybe he's an amalgam of other people. I think he was just a figment of Charlotte Bronte's imagination. But nevertheless, this is one of the things that Elizabeth Gaskell uncovered. And she knew very quickly there was no way to rationalize this for the public. She couldn't explain that she wanted to present Charlotte Bronte as a virtuous person. She couldn't then reveal that she was in love with a married man because this would go against all the conventional ideas of Victorian womanhood. So she suppressed that information and kept it quiet. And those letters were never seen until the 20th century. They disappeared and then resurfaced during the
mm.
First World War when the man's children actually donated them to the British Library. So that was one of the secrets that Elizabeth Gaskell discovered. In terms of professional rivalries, many people today will still say that William Thackeray, who's the author of Vanity Fair and a grand man of Victorian letters, was one of Charlotte Bronte's champions. He was far from it. Many of the biographies of Charlotte Bronte present them as friends, but they weren't friends. He didn't really like Charlotte Bronte that much and thought she was ridiculous. And in many instances tried to humiliate her publicly because he felt that she was the kind of person he could be cruel to and he could make fun of. He saw her as a woman without any social status, without any means of support, without any economic support. And so he felt he could be cruel to her. And I'm happy to set the record straight and show that he was an unpleasant individual. It was something that Gaskell couldn't do because he was alive at that point and very powerful. So she glosses over that. And so because she glossed over it, many of the other biographers have glossed over that too, and have just imagined that Charlotte and William Thackeray were friends.
Mhm.
They weren't.
Was
The
she at
record.
all in not competition, but like was any of that rivalry amongst her own sisters?
That's a very interesting question because that's one of the conventional myths that they were all in competition with each other. There's not a single piece of evidence to show that they were. There was a play written not that long ago which showed that Charlotte Bronte was this very ambitious, ruthless person who wanted to erase her sister's memory from the public consciousness and be the only famous one. Now there's no evidence of that at all from the historic record. It comes from later ideas in the 19th century when biographies were being written about the family. And at that time, men were generally trying to work out how these women, just women, could have written great works of literature. And they characterized them in very particular ways, that they were almost like a coven of witches with strange powers, or that they were, you put women together and they all compete, or they conspire together, or they're rivals. These were very misogynistic ideas of women that late Victorian men had and deployed them in their explanations of the Brontes. And those ideas continue to filter through the 20th century, right through to the present day. But as I say, in the written record, we can see no trace of rivalry between the sisters at all. They supported each other, they respected each other, but they also knew that they were very different talents and they wrote very differently as well. That's something that's forgotten today. We tend to see them as a kind of a genre almost, that they all write the same type of books. Set in England, set in a particular time with governesses and old houses. Okay, yes, that's true. But their concerns are very different as well. So they were drastically different novelists. And no, there wasn't competition between them.
Excellent. That's good to know. Women should stand up for each other.
Absolutely.
I'm going to try to get to some of these questions. Graham has agreed to stay a little bit longer to make sure we get to as many as possible. April asks, why did Charlotte write such gloomy stories? And from everything you just said, there's a reason she had a pretty gloomy life.
Yeah, it very much reflected the reality that she knew. Um, some people describe her books as gothic. And what they really mean is the darkness that's within her books. So yes, gloomy is a good way to describe it. If you've ever seen the house that she grew up in, Haworth Parsonage, it's surrounded by a graveyard, and there's a church at the end of it. It was just a very small village, and so it was a desperate time, I suppose. She also grew up in an atmosphere of grief. Her mother died when she was 4, leaving 6 children. And then her 2 eldest sisters died at aged 10 and 11. And she was sent to this quite hellish boarding school. So there was lots of misery in her early life, and lots of early deaths, injustice. She saw all of that firsthand. And so, as someone who felt that she was, going back to what I said earlier, without any kind of status in the world, she felt she was an invisible woman. She said at one point that if anyone in a room happened to look at her once, they made sure never to make that mistake again. So
Oh.
she felt that physically she didn't feel attractive. Because she had no social standing, she felt that there was really no hope for her in the world. And
Mm.
her sisters felt something very similar as well. So if you can imagine the mindset of someone who feels that they have no place in the world, but they're in it and they're seeing everything that has happened in it, and they can translate those events into prose, they become witnesses to other people's suffering in a way. So I think that's what they were doing. They were turning their own pain into literature.
Mhm.
And that pain emerges in Jane Eyre and in a book like Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, which you said, you spoke earlier about revisiting the Bronte novels. I think that's the one that surprises the most when we revisit it, because we imagine it's a romance of, people swooning on the moors. Then we discover it's full of violence and sadism and cruelty, and that takes many people by surprise. Because we like to imagine, don't we, that the England of that time was very genteel and everyone was lovely and things were simpler. Well, they were just as complicated, and times were as full of cruelty and exploitation as they are today.
Mhm. Yeah. Although I find Jane Eyre to be particularly hopeful in some ways,
Mm,
like the ending. So like I don't want to get
yeah.
into like the ending and all that,
Yes.
but I do
But
think that
that's a very
there's
good point. That's a good point, because so it's, the gloom is redeemed. There is hope.
yeah.
The book's, as you say, Jane Eyre is a hopeful book because she persists. She continues, even in Wuthering Heights. There's redemption at the end as transformation begins, when compassion comes into their world
Mm,
and everything starts to transform. So they present a world as they saw it, bleak, but in some ways provide answers for how we can redeem that bleakness.
hmm. Thank you. I'm glad you said that. Vicky's asks, was it Henry Hughes in Massachusetts who outed the Brontes?
That's not the name, no. It's
No,
Vicky
that's
Pope.
okay. I just thought I'd ask that really quickly.
Yes, no, I will find the name. I can't remember, but I do mention it in my book.
All right, so everybody run out and get the book. You know that. Um, Eileen asks, did the scandal affect the popularity of Gaskell's fiction? And there was another question about what happened to the royalties from her fiction. Did she make a lot of money?
Oh, these are very interesting questions. Well, taking them in order, so it did affect Gaskell's fiction. Gaskell's, I mean, her reputation continued to be affected right into the 20th century. I think Elizabeth Gaskell is a novelist who should be seen on the same equivalence as someone like Dickens. We all know Charles Dickens. Not as many people know Elizabeth Gaskell. But if you're to read a novel like Cranford, which is just the most beautiful and funny and touching and entertaining novel, or North and South, which is about employer-employee relations, so much of it still feels current today.
Hmm.
So she deserves to be rediscovered and she deserves to be appraised as she was. I'm not saying she's a forgotten novelist. Of course she isn't. And of course she has been considered to be a prominent Victorian novelist. I think she's deserving of more praise than she's been given. So in terms of the Bronte royalties, that's very interesting. So the situation was quite complex because Emily and Anne died before they were married and before they had wills. Their literary estates were inherited by their father. Charlotte's was inherited by her husband. And when Patrick, the sister's father, died, Arthur, Charlotte's widower, inherited the copyrights of all of the novels. And he ultimately sold the copyright to a man called Clement Shorter in the late 1890s. Arthur lived into the 20th century. He was very old by that point, but he sold the copyright of the Bronte novels to Clement Shorter, who continued, along with his family, to accept the royalties of the Bronte novels for, I think, into the 1920s and 30s. And then they went out of copyright. But yeah, so they
Wow.
were ultimately inherited by people who weren't related to them.
Hmm. Sarah asked this question about Patrick.
Hmm.
Didn't he provide the opportunity for the children to have access to an excellent education, even though they were living in Yorkshire with limited resources? And doesn't that speak to him being somewhat more progressive or enlightened? And that's why Gaskell, but then why would Gaskell speak badly about him?
Well, because she knew him, is the short answer. She met him, she knew Patrick Bronte, and also she spoke to many witnesses, and none of them had anything good to say about him, unfortunately. People like to defend Patrick Bronte and want to redeem him because I think they want to imagine that their lives were beautiful. But the trouble with that is that there's evidence that demonstrates otherwise. It's true that Patrick Bronte did educate his children. It's unfortunate that his choice of school was the Lowood of Jane Eyre.
Hmm.
Patrick wasn't alone in deciding that children should be educated. After all, the headmaster of Lowood thought the same. People imagine that it's maybe a radical idea to educate girls at that time. It wasn't. The school that Charlotte Bronte went to was a girls' school in the 1830s. So it was a charity school run by the Reverend Carus Wilson. But he believed in educating girls as well. We would hardly describe him as a radical.
Hmm.
Um, it's true that Patrick did have talents, and it's true that he did have, virtues. Patrick believed that his role in life was appointed by God to save the souls of Haworth. That was his primary role in life. It's interesting when people in the past have defended Patrick Bronte as a father, they talk about him being a vicar, and the two aren't the same,
Right.
really. So they tend to talk about his work as within the parish and not the very complex relationship he had with all of his children. Now, everyone who knew the Brontes, including Charlotte Bronte herself, who relayed her life to Elizabeth Gaskell, talked about their relationship with Patrick Bronte. It doesn't make him a monster, although some of Charlotte's friends called him that, described him as an old monster or as a selfish old man was something that one of Charlotte's friends said. Many people felt that Charlotte had been used by her father as almost as a servant, and that he didn't recognize her genius. And that we can see the evidence of that. That's complex, though. We can't set them up as enemies. They had a very complex parent-child relationship, which Charlotte at one point described as being that she couldn't sort of live with or without her father, terrified that she would lose him, but also tortured by the relationship.
Mm.
Well, we might all identify with some of that in some ways. It's not uncommon. But again, it's laid out in the written record. We can see it within the recollections of people who'd known the Bronte family. And uh, much of Elizabeth Gaskell's own material came from Charlotte herself and from Patrick. So Gaskell was able to evaluate the man in person. So that's why she was slightly cynical about him.
Hmm. I have a couple of questions about if you think Charlotte was more popular or revered as an author than her sisters was and is. Like, was she back then and is she now?
She was back then, and that's simply because she lived longer and published more novels than
Hmm.
both of her sisters. Emily published one novel, Wuthering Heights, and Anne published two novels, Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And they were all within the same period, so between 1847 and 1849. Charlotte lived on after that period and published three more novels. So it was longevity. I mean, they all should have had decades ahead of them. It's easy to forget how young they were,
Hmm.
actually. If Anne Bronte had lived to be as old as some of her contemporaries, she would have lived into the 20th century. She would have lived to the First World War. It's extraordinary to think of that, a Bronte living that long, but none of them lived past the age of 40. So they were all very, very young when they died. But Charlotte at the time, because of her relative longevity, I mean, I don't want to make her sound like she was elderly. She died at the age of 38 and she only survived her sister Anne by 6 years.
Hmm.
Um, she became almost the figurehead, the relatable one that the public could interact with, and that the press could comment on. The others, Emily and Anne's novels at the time were troubled readers and troubled critics. The opinions were very split about the morality of their books. But because Charlotte could publish more and more books, people could have a refreshed view of her. She tended to be, because of Elizabeth Gaskell's biography of her, she tended to be the figurehead of the family in a way. So many people have felt that she overshadowed her sisters. But that wasn't her intention in life. That's just what happened posthumously as the family were received through history.
Hmm. Lori asks, do you know how she came up with the character of Bertha Mason? Do you know if it was based on someone?
No, we don't. We don't know that. There's no documentary evidence about that. We can't trace. It's very speculative, actually, that we try and draw connections between Charlotte Bronte's characters and real people. But the interesting thing is, we do know that some of them really were based on real people, and some of those real people were able to identify themselves in Jane Eyre and Shirley. Um, Charlotte Bronte's publisher recognized himself in the novel Villette and actually said, there are whole conversations that I had with my own mother in that book. So he knew that much of what Charlotte produced in her novels actually had come from her lived experience and from her life. She was repurposing reality for fiction. She started that at a very early age. But in terms of Bertha Mason, no, we don't have an original for her, but we do have originals for people like Mr. Brocklehurst, Miss Temple, Helen Burns, some of the other Jane Eyre characters. Mr. Rochester's up for debate, and as I say, many people have felt he was an amalgam of several men. But the interesting thing is when we look back at Charlotte Bronte's juvenilia, we can see Rochester-like figures there as well. So he was always in her imagination, even from an early age. Great
Char
question.
Patricia asks, did Charlotte destroy an unfinished manuscript written by Emily after Emily died?
Love this question. Thank you so much for asking it. Well, let's talk about the manuscript evidence for this. So the idea that there was a second novel by Emily Bronte originates in Juliet Barker's book, The Brontes, which was published in, I think, 1996. And that the idea that there was a second novel came from a letter which was discovered just before that point, which was addressed to Dear Sir from Emily and Anne's publisher. And it cautioned the person to take their time with their next novel. Now, that letter seemed to fit an envelope that had Ellis Bell, which is Emily's pseudonym, on it. So it was assumed that these two things went together. However, and so Julie Barker concluded that there was a second novel. This novel was for Emily. She was writing another novel. And as it doesn't exist, the manuscript must have been destroyed, and the person who must have destroyed it was Charlotte. So there are several leaps of logic, in my opinion, there. Now, when we go back to the written record, what we can see is Charlotte Bronte saying that in 1848, she tells her publisher that Emily was too ill to write anything after Wuthering Heights. She was actually very ill with tuberculosis for almost the whole year after she published Wuthering Heights, and she died exactly a year later. Um, we can also see that Charlotte Bronte preserved manuscripts from both Emily and Anne, because she says in a letter at the same time that people were writing to her asking for samples of their handwriting, and she said, "I can't part with a scrap of it." She was trying to collate everything she found. So what we have to do is what Charlotte Bronte preserved. The letter that Juliet Barker thought was for Emily, I think is actually for Anne Bronte, because it fits with the timeline of Anne writing her second novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and it was from the same publisher. So I think it's mistaken identity. So essentially, there is absolutely nothing in the written record that indicates there really was a second novel, or that Charlotte Bronte had destroyed any of the papers of her sisters. The interesting thing is that what we do have is examples of Patrick, their father, destroying manuscripts and sending them out as memorabilia to really anyone who asked for them. So there are fragments of letters that sometimes, the fragments are sometimes just a single word long, and he's attached a note saying, "By my daughter Charlotte," and dated when he sent it off. And we've got those dated between 1857 and 1861, his death. So we do know that he is the only person in the family we can actually verifiably say destroyed manuscripts. We can't say that about Charlotte, because first of all, there's no evidence that Emily did write a second novel, and that Charlotte destroyed it. As I say, in 1850, when she was preparing a new edition of Wuthering Heights with her publisher, she was looking for any new material that could go with it, because the publishers were like publishers of today, going, "Well, what's going to be new about this edition? We need something else to go with it." Charlotte went through her sister's papers, and all she could find was poetry. And so she did include poetry in the new edition, but not a second novel, unfortunately. Great question. Thank you for
it. I'm not sure we'll get to all of these questions, and Graham has offered to send me an email with all of the answers if we don't get to them. So no worries on your questions not being answered. If you could ask Charlotte and Gaskell one question, what would it be?
Oh, that's so interesting. What would I ask them? Well, it's really interesting, because I did have to think about interrogating both of them when I was writing the book. What would I really want to know? What was Gaskell's true intentions? I would ask them very specific questions about the house that Charlotte Bronte lived in, the Bronte parsonage. I would ask them for physical descriptions of their siblings, more exact descriptions. I would want to know about things that happened in the gaps in our knowledge. I would want to know how Gaskell felt about recanting the truth, and how she lived with that afterwards. So yeah, I'd love to interview them.
That's a good one. Actually, somebody said in the chat, as you completed your timeline in 1860, Gaskell sent Patrick a portrait, and shortly after, she and her daughter Meta visited Reverend Bronte. Do you have any thoughts on what that portrait might have been, or its purpose? Early scholars suggested it was a portrait of Elizabeth herself.
I don't know. Gaskell didn't send Patrick Bronte a portrait at any point. So I think that there might be some mistake there. I think the portrait that was received by Patrick Bronte was sent by George Smith, who was Charlotte Bronte's publisher. We know that portrait is actually hanging in the National Portrait Gallery in London. It was painted by drawn by George Richmond. It's the drawing you see of Charlotte Bronte on almost everyone. Not this drawing, but not this painting. But Gaskell didn't send any portraits to Patrick Bronte. She didn't have any portraits of Charlotte Bronte in my book, I document how she actually tried to secure a portrait of Charlotte Bronte. She wanted a copy of the Richmond portrait. So she had to get an early photographer to go to the house and take a daguerreotype of it. And arranging that was quite arduous, because it didn't work. And Charlotte's husband didn't want that to happen. So there was a very difficult negotiation to actually secure it. The reason she wanted it, she said, was just for her own sentimental reasons, but it was actually so they could put it into the book. So yeah, I think the question I might be thinking of the portrait that was sent by George Smith to Patrick Bronte. Yeah.
Okay. Mitchell asked this a while ago, and I was saving it sort of for the end. Do you see yourself continuing to research the Brontes? Are there any other writers you'd be eager to write about?
Oh, well, yes, in reverse order, absolutely. There are many other writers that I'm fascinated by. I love Virginia Woolf. She's
Mm.
another passion of mine. But yes, I'm still researching the Brontes, and I'm looking at other areas of their lives and other members of the family. So, yes, it's going to continue.
So we'll have to have you back, Graham, when the second book comes out.
You do, yes.
I've
Yes.
had a couple of questions about the fact that Jane Austen was, sort of a contemporary. Did Charlotte ever comment on her work, or was there any competition there?
Yeah, she didn't like Jane Austen.
Oh,
She didn't like her work, actually. So Jane Austen had died before Charlotte was born, but her novels obviously continued and were being read and were popular. So Charlotte hadn't read her novels by the time she'd written Jane Eyre. So she wrote that before she read any of Jane Austen's novels. But her publisher sent her a gift of, I think, Pride and Prejudice and Emma. Charlotte wasn't impressed by them. She thought they were too quiet and too muted. She said they were almost, it was like a photograph of a garden, very ordered and very genteel. And she was wild at heart. So she wanted the outdoors. She wanted untrammeled passions and vengeful feelings. And you don't really find much of that in Jane Austen.
well, yeah, because they were different stories,
Yeah, and they were both,
different
yes, they were
commentaries.
exactly that. They had very different perspectives. Jane Austen obviously came from a very different world to Charlotte Bronte, and she lived longer. So, well, I mean, she wrote more. So they're actually not at all similar. Often, it's interesting that people do put them together as though they were comparable novelists, but they aren't at all. I wonder what Jane Austen would have made of Charlotte Bronte.
Mm,
Something we'll never know.
no, but we
We
can
can certainly guess. Yeah.
Yes. You would probably have a better guess than me, but I think that it would be
Hmm.
a really fun thing to think about. Um,
Absolutely.
Daya asks, is there evidence of influence or editing of letters or later works by Arthur Bell Nichols over Charlotte, i.e., letters to Ellen, Nussey, etc.?
Yes. So we can see evidence of editing from the very beginning, actually. So when Elizabeth Gaskell requested letters from witnesses being everyone who'd known Charlotte Bronte, she went out to each of them and wanted to interview them personally and then asked them if they had letters from Charlotte that she could look at. So that meant that Elizabeth Gaskell saw a whole spectrum of correspondence. So imagine that. Imagine someone asking to see your WhatsApp messages to all your friends and the different voices you use for your parents or your siblings or your work colleagues. That's essentially what Gaskell found. She found a spectrum of different voices. Um, but among those letters were letters from Ellen Nussey, Charlotte's best friend, that had been censored. Ellen had scored out parts of it that she didn't want Elizabeth Gaskell to see. We can read those letters still exist now, and we can see what Ellen Nussey was hiding. And it was essentially details about her own family. She wanted them to be kept out of Gaskell's biography. Interesting that she might have not trusted Elizabeth Gaskell with that information and felt she had to cancel it. I
Mhm.
think the question I was asking specifically, is there evidence of Arthur Bell Nichols editing letters? No, there isn't evidence that he edited letters, although he felt that he could edit Charlotte's first novel, The Professor, which was published posthumously. Um, by the time Arthur didn't want to talk about the Brontes at all for decades, and so was silent until the 1890s, until he was tracked down in Ireland. And then he was interviewed by people, but he didn't sanction an edition of her letters, except for a book called Charlotte Brontë and Her Circle. He released some letters, but some of them were redacted. So we could call that a kind of editing where parts of the letters were printed and the juicier parts that we see now were cut out. So I guess he did have an influence in some ways, but he didn't consciously go through and redact or prepare them for publication. If that's, I hope that answers the question. Yeah,
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm just going to ask one more question. We have a
sure.
couple more, but I'm going to ask this one last one because the Brontes, like Austen, is televised and adapted all
Yeah.
the time. Like there's so many different versions. So one person wants to know if the BBC production To Walk Invisible is it accurate to reflect Charlotte's relationship with her family and with her publisher? And what is your thought on the new Wuthering Heights movie? Because it's Dawn says it's horrible.
Yes, To Walk Invisible is wonderful, and I think it's the closest we've come to any accurate representation of the family. Of course, it's a drama, so it has to take some liberties and invent conversations. But I mean, the research that went into that production was extensive, right down to reproducing the building they lived in and their clothes. So yeah, I would say that's the accurate one. The Wuthering Heights adaptation that's coming up it looks interesting, doesn't it? It looks like a free adaptation of the book, let's put it like that. Can I answer one question that I saw come up
Yes.
there? And it was about, I can't, sorry, I didn't see your name because the question came up too quickly, but why did Charlotte suppress Anne's novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall? This is one of the great myths about the Brontes, that she did do that. This is something that you see repeated again and again, that Charlotte blocked its republication. She didn't. She absolutely didn't. How do we know that? We actually have the edition that Charlotte authorised in 1853, and we have Charlotte's agreement for its republication. But the idea, going back to the concept of there being competition, informed this suggestion that Charlotte was jealous of Anne's talent and that she had forbidden any republication of her work. The evidence shows otherwise. She didn't. There's an edition of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall published after Anne's death, 4 years after Anne's death, authorized by Charlotte.
Hmm. Wow. Thank you for that. I did see that question come up a couple times and was also curious. Um, so people want that Virginia Woolf talk.
I happily do that. I'll have to write the book first of all, but yeah, I mean, Virginia Woolf is one of those voices. Again, an iconic figure like Charlotte Bronte. People often feel that her voice is an intimate voice. They feel connected to her, and especially they're captivated by her life. I'm very interested in her as well.
Mhm. And these aren't necessarily questions, but well, maybe they are. I just want to end with this. Did Barbara wants to know if Charlotte had any joy in her life, and Vicky wants to know if if she hadn't died so tragically early, would she have continued writing, and would we have like this like amazing, bookshelf
Yeah,
of
yeah.
content from her?
So, to answer the first question, did she have joy in her life? Yes, she did. We can see in her letters that she could be quite sarcastic and funny. She had a sense of humor. That's not often how she's portrayed, but she really did. There was joy in her life. Her husband, Arthur, did bring her a lot of happiness. This is a controversial topic because a lot of people think that they weren't happy or they weren't really in love. In my book, I detail how she gradually allowed herself to fall in love and allowed herself to be someone's first choice in a relationship, which was a big step for her. So she did find happiness ultimately. She did win in the end. She nearly made it. She nearly made it to full happiness. She almost got there. Vicky's question about would Charlotte have continued writing, I've no doubt that she would have continued writing. I think she would have become more and more experimental in her writing. I think Villette, which was her final published novel, has puzzled many readers, even from its publication. People wondered it was so dark and so somber, but is actually a not, in my opinion, it's a novel of someone, internalized perspective of someone losing their sanity.
Mhm.
Radical. This is before Dostoevsky, of course. This is before the psychological novel. She was experimenting with that, and I think that she would have continued to be more experimental. There's a school of thought that says that Jane Eyre changed the course of the English novel. And James Joyce, I think, had said that he couldn't have written Ulysses without the interiority of Jane Eyre.
Hmm.
And that also gave rise to people like Virginia Woolf in terms of the interior monologue and stream of consciousness. Some writers trace that back to Jane Eyre. So who knows what discoveries she would have produced in her later years? We were robbed of it all.
And certainly the impact is, you know, uh,
It's ongoing.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's unaccounted. You can't account for it. Like it's just
No, because
constant.
you can see the impact of Jane Eyre in novels like Fifty Shades of Grey,
Mhm.
in popular novels. The echoes of Jane Eyre are still being repeated because for many writers, she is the female ancestor.
Mhm.
She is the one that they refer to. Like you, Mina, she had that personal relationship. sent to a red room as you were because you were being naughty. And then they discover this other world where a child is standing up for themselves and being angry. And for many people, that's thrilling. And I think as people continue to rediscover Jane Eyre for the first time, they're thrilled all over again.
Mm. What did she die of? Just really quick.
She died of morning sickness, actually. Yeah. Her
Oh,
death certificate says phthisis, which is wasting. That was often synonymously linked with tuberculosis. But it's rather like saying that coughing is tuberculosis. They're not the same thing. That phthisis is a symptom. So it was a wasting condition. But we can see in her letters from her father, her husband, and herself, she mentions that she was expecting a baby, and the complications of that were a severe form of morning sickness.
mhm. That is so sad. And also the fact that
Yeah,
she lost so much of her family. But it's really nice to know from from your information that you gathered that she did have joy in her life and she
yeah.
did ultimately have some happiness. So
She
thank you.
triumphed in the end. Yeah, she did.
Yeah. Thank you, Graham, so much. It's for staying as well, but amazing questions from this audience. Thank you all
Thank
for
you.
participating so fully. And I hope you all read this book because it's wonderful, and we'll look forward to whatever comes out from your brain after this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone who joined. This is my very first US event, so thank you for being part of it. My book, as I say, was only published last week in the US, and it's just an absolute honor to speak to you from Scotland on this day. So thank you all, and thank you for your questions. Thank you for being so interested in this. It's a
Thank you.
pleasure.
Yes, well, have a wonderful evening, Graham. I know it's evening there for you, and hopefully you'll catch Tom Holland at some point. And for everybody who's here, I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and just wonderful reading. Catch this book somehow, some way. You can find it at the library as well. Bye,
Thank you
everybody.
very much. Bye bye. Bye.